Could I have the first slide? I understand I cannot use this. I cannot really change the slides from here. So you go back to the first slide. If instead of being here, we were in the 5th century in Greece, we would be very much impressed by looking at the way the ancient Greek Hippocratic physicians thought about health. In essence, they were very much interested in prevention, but because the word prevention has negative connotation in Greeks, they refer to it as the concept of positive health, or what today we refer to in English as good health. And positive health requires a knowledge of man's primary constitution, what today we call genetics, and of the powers of various foods, both those that have been created by man, as well as those that occur naturally. So the word natural, which today we are trying to define, really was recognized for its importance 2,500 years ago. But it said eating alone is not enough for health. There must also be exercise. There must be exercise. The effects must likewise be known. In fact, they were in the process of trying to define how much exercise and what type of the various diseases, and they thought of the idea of even writing a prescription for that. The combination of these two things, in other words, nutrition and physical fitness, make regimen where proper attention is given to the season of the year, the change of the wind. So he really emphasized the importance of the environment. But out of all the environmental factors, what is very important is the fact that if there is any deficit in food or exercise, the body will fall sick. And this is really a prophecy, more or less, because that's what's happened in Western cultures today. There is deficit of exercise, people really are not physically active, and there are deficiencies when it comes to the essential fatty acids. Next slide. So this whole concept that I just read to you is very important because it took almost 2,500 years ago to put it into molecular terms. And it was about in 1990 when Barton Childs, with whom I worked at that time, developed the concept that the phenotype, what we appear to be, is the result of the interactions between our genes and the environment. And it's the continuous interaction of the two throughout development that actually shape the individual. And this is exactly what the Hippocratic physicians thought. I can tell you this concept, which today is very well accepted, it took a long time for people to understand, because people thought for a long time that genetics is destiny, which is not the case. The next slide, please. So if we go back and think in terms of evolution, it's important to understand that food production did not take place until 10,000 years ago. But our genetic profile was already pretty well established during the Paleolithic period, 10 to 50,000 years ago. But today, where the genes are the same, our food supply and our food intake are quite different. Next slide, please. So if we were to present all this graphically, you can see that human beings appeared about 4 million years ago. And knowledge that we have collected from studying hunter-gatherers and from looking at graves and looking at caves where we find food, we know that the food supply was very well balanced in terms of the essential fatty acids, the omega-6 and omega-3, what you see here in red and blue. The blue are the omega-3 fatty acids and the red are the 6. So what has happened is, where during evolution there was a balance. Today, we have a lot of saturated fat intake. We have a high amount of total fat. We also have much less of the vitamin C and much less of the vitamin E. And what this means is where our genetic profile has not changed, because of the changes in the food supply, individuals that are genetically predisposed are much more prone to chronic diseases because of the dietary changes not being in harmony with the genetic environment and profile. Next slide, please. So what I would like to do is I would like to focus a little bit on the essential fatty acids before I move into the Greek diet. What we have, the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids are essential because we need to take them from our diet. The body cannot make them. The omega-6 fatty acids are found in vegetable oils, such as corn oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil, where the omega-3 fatty acids are found in canola oil and in green leafy vegetables. These two families of the omega-6 and omega-3 essential fatty acids are metabolically and physiologically distinct, and they use the same enzymes to metabolize. So if you have a diet that is very high in omega-6 fatty acids, it interferes with the normal elongation and desaturation of the enzymes. And today, because the animals are grain-fed instead of grazed, their meat is full of omega-6 fatty acids. Also, because we don't eat fish, we eat very little fish. Fish are very rich sources of omega-3 fatty acids, where the animal meat from grain is just nothing but only omega-6 fatty acids. So a combination of grain-fed meat production and high vegetable oil production, which has only taken place only for about 200 years, has led to enormous amounts of omega-6 fatty acids, so that the ratio that once was 1 between the omega-6 and the omega-3s is now 20 to 1. And this becomes very important because when these fatty acids are metabolized in the body, they become the parent fatty acids of prostaglandins and leukotrienes, the hormone-like substances. And the prostaglandins from the omega-6, the arachidonic acid, are pro-thrombotic and pro-inflammatory, so that the Western diets today are definitely pro-inflammatory diets. The prostaglandins and leukotrienes from the omega-3 fatty acids are less inflammatory and less thrombotic. So the moment you have an imbalance of the fatty acids in the body, then you have imbalances in the production of the various thromboplastins, leukotrienes. These are all pro-inflammatory compounds. Next slide. So here then is the arachidonic acid, either from the diet or when it's released from the cells. And here is the icosapentaenoic acid, the omega-3s. And we then, through the various enzymes, we have the production of thromboplastins and leukotrienes. And the leukotrienes that come from arachidonic acid are prothrombotic. Those of icosapentaenoic acid are less so. Next slide, please. But in addition to having a diet that is pro-inflammatory, with a great production of leukotrienes and other inflammatory cytokines, we also have the problem that for what follows inflammation is the resolution of inflammation, and you need to have the appropriate compounds in your body for proper resolution of inflammation to take place. So because of EPA, omega-3 fatty acid, and DHA, omega-3 fatty acids, they produce substances that help in the resolution of inflammation. And in case of DHA, it also develops substances, produces substances called protectants, and they're very important for normal brain function. They're called neuroprotectants. Next slide, please. So if we go back and we want to understand what was this ratio of the essential fatty acids of omega-3 and omega-6, and we compare the Western diets versus the Paleolithic diet, the omega-6 LA, the parent fatty acid, and the omega-3, the ratio, during the Paleolithic period was less than 1, where today is 18 to 1. And then the longer fatty acids of the omega-6 and omega-3 found in animals and fish and also in eggs and butter, they had a much lower ratio than today. So when you add all the fatty acids together, the essential fatty acids, you come up with a ratio of less than 1 versus a total of 16. And all Northern European countries, Western Europe, the United States, have a ratio between an average ratio of 16, meaning that it varies anywhere from 12 to 20. Next slide, please. So people in other parts of the world, they have looked very carefully to see what is the essential fatty acid intake in the various diets. And we start with the Paleolithic diet. Up here, and the ratio is less than 1. However, the studies that I did in Greece prior to 1960, it was the diet that was closest to the Paleolithic diet in terms of the ratio. It is a diet that is consistent with evolution. And you can see what's in the United States, UK. Japan is one of the very few countries where the ratio is good because they eat a lot of fish. And in India, in the rural part of India, they eat a lot of green leafy vegetables and they don't use much oil. Whereas in the urban part of India, where they use corn oil, they have one of the highest ratios and also one of the highest rates of diabetes. Next slide, please. So people have begun to look very carefully at the ratio of the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in platelets in various groups. And as you can see, the arachidonic acid, which is the omega-6, is very high in Europe and the United States. It's much lower in Japan, but it's the lowest in Greenland Eskimos because they eat a lot of fish and blubber. So they cause a pentanoic acid, and then the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the United States, because there is a lot of arachidonic acid and very little icosapentaenoid from fish oils. This ratio is 50 versus 12 in Japan versus 1 in Greenland. And as you look at the cardiovascular mortality, it follows the ratio. The higher the ratio, the higher the mortality from cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. So in India, where a few years ago they tried to increase the energy intake of the population, and the easiest way to do it is to have the population eat more oil. And the United States sold a lot of corn oil, but the people in the rural area, they really were never used to corn oil, so they did not bother using it at all. Where the richer people in the cities, they did use corn oil. And as you can see, as the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 increased, so did the prevalence of diabetes. So there is very good evidence that the ratio is very important. It was balanced during evolution. When the ratio increases, cardiovascular disease increases, and diabetes also increases. And this is a study that was carried out at Mass General Hospital by Dr. Khan, where he wanted to find a way to see if you can take the enzyme that converts omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3, whether you can actually have an animal model or you can study the various diseases. So he took the enzyme, he took the delta-3 desaturase, the enzyme that will convert omega-6 18-linoleic acid into omega-3 and transfected the enzyme into cells and now that in the whole animal. And what happens is once you put the enzyme in, you actually make omega-3s from omega-6. So the ratio, which is 14.7 before you put in the enzyme, drops down to 0.9. And this is the very first evidence that you can actually change the production of omega-3 fatty acids. These animals, who then he has followed as a model for coronary heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, the animal that does not have the enzyme and has high ratios of omega-6 to omega-3, they develop more atherosclerosis, they develop more cancer, they develop more arthritis, more hypertension. And so the idea is eventually to have these transgenic animals for human consumption. Of course, there are a lot of people who object to transgenic animals. That's another story. Next slide, please. So I explained and spent a lot of time, and I hope I have persuaded you that the essential fatty acids are very important, that they have to be balanced, that if they're not balanced, individuals cannot be healthy. So you all recognize this map, and I really wanted to just look just right there where Kalamata is on the Messinian Gulf. Yeah, right. Next slide, please. So before the Second World War, in the early 1930s, there was a great deal of interest to find out why the various populations in Europe had different rates of mortality as well as different rates of heart disease. And they were ready in 1940 to begin such a study, and the Rockefeller Foundation was interested, but then the war broke out, and they were not able to do the study. But later on, in 1948, there were Keyes and other investigators from the United States got together with scientists in Italy, Holland, the then Yugoslavia, Finland, Japan, and the United States, and they set up the 7-country study because they wanted to evaluate why the people in Crete had the lowest rate of heart disease, they lived the longest, and had the lowest rate of cancer. Next slide. So they did carry out the 7-country studies, and as you can see from this slide, when we compare the life expectancy and disease rates between the United States and Crete, you can see that the life expectancy is much higher in Crete for both men and women. The coronary heart disease is much lower. Cerebrovascular disease is much lower. Breast cancer is much lower. Stomach cancer is higher. And the reason it is higher, it is because they did not have refrigeration, and they ate a lot of salty foods. And salty foods has been associated with higher cancer of the stomach, much less colorectal cancer and total cancers. So there was very obvious differences in between among the populations. The people in Crete had the lowest rate of heart disease, the lowest rate of cancer, but I compare them here to the United States since we're here right now. Next slide, please. So the question is, how different were their diets? And remember, these are diets prior to 1960. The Greek diet today is not as good as it was prior to 1960, unfortunately. So what you see here is that the amount of energy that comes from fat really did not differ significantly. In other words, the total fat in the diet was not that different between Crete and the United States. But the saturated fat was much lower. They ate a lot more fruits and legumes. And legumes are very important because legumes have higher protein and also omega-3 fatty acids. They ate more bread and potatoes, much less meat, and a lot more fish. And I should tell you about that because when they did the questionnaires, the people who went to Crete and asked, they didn't ask, they didn't say, do you eat sardines, do you eat herring? They said, trotepsari, do you eat fish? And most people interpreted it to mean that it was fresh fish. And of course, people did not eat that much fresh fish. So when I went back and looked at the questionnaire, it was very obvious that they had forgotten to calculate the sardines and herrings. And sardines are very rich source, more so than other fish for omega-3s, and the same with herring. So I went back and recalculated that. So the people from the 7 country studies, they totally missed the point because of the way the question was asked. Next slide, please. So the people from the 7 country studies then came back to the US and they started this enormous campaign. And this is from the back of the National Geographic back in 1969. And they said, we are going to change the food supply, we're going to change the oils, we're not going to have butter, and we're going to make margarine. And they put the whole country on an experiment. Next slide, please. And let me show you how bad this experiment is. Because what you see here as blue is all omega-6, linoleic acid. Enormous amount of omega-6 fatty acids. And what you see as orange is the alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3. So that when they used corn oil, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 was 66 to 1. Now, if you look at olive oil has very little omega-3, less than 1%. But the beauty of olive oil is it's very low in omega-6. Olive oil does not have much omega-3s, but it is the lowest in omega-6, and that's what makes olive oil very good. Next slide. So, at the same time, when people looked at the data from these various countries, they found out that at the same cholesterol level, okay, here, the same cholesterol level, the coronary heart disease mortality differed. For example, let's say at this point, it is much higher for the countries in Western Europe and so forth. So at that time, I was the chair of the coordinating committee for nutrition research at the NIH, and then eventually the whole government, and then eventually the White House. So I began to ask the question, what was different that at the same cholesterol level, the people in Crete had such good statistics in terms of cardiovascular disease and in terms of cancer and in terms of longevity. And having been born in Greece and knowing a lot about what people ate, I decided to focus on the very basic foods that Greeks eat. And I started with wild plants, because horta, wild plants, is something that is eaten all over Greece. Next slide, please. And beginner's luck has it, the first wild plant that I studied was purslane, or adrachla in Greek, or the listrida. And it's eaten everywhere. I also found out that purslane is the 8th most commonly distributed edible wild plant in the world. So it had a lot of importance in terms of evolution, in terms of global health, in terms of overall diet. So we did very extensive studies, and it just so happened that purslane was growing on the grounds of the National Institutes of Health. There was a little garden there, and right next to it were the wife of the director of the Institute of Aging was growing her own vegetables, and the purslane had taken over the garden. And so I had an opportunity then to just collect the purslane and compare it at the same time from the same place with spinach, next slide, and a lot of other vegetables. For example, so here is the purslane from the same garden with spinach, butter crunch, red mustard. And as you can see, when it comes to alpha-linolenic acid omega-3, the purslane is 8 times as high as any of the others. So that was absolutely fascinating because since it has a high amount of alpha-linolenic acid, it has to have a lot more vitamins and antioxidants in order to maintain its life. Next slide, please. And as you can see, if you were to take 100 grams of purslane, which is a dish of salad made with purslane, you get as much as 300 to 400 milligrams alpha-linolenic acid. You get 12 milligrams of vitamin E, which is exactly the requirement, and vitamin C, beta-carotene, and glutathione. And glutathione is a very important nutrient because it has anti-carcinogenic and antioxidant properties, so it's very important in terms of health. And there are not that many plants that have so much glutathione. For example, out of 100 plants that we checked, there were only 2 others that had levels very similar to purslane. One was asparagus, and the other was avocado, which really showed that in other climates, the glutathione has to come from other foods. Next slide, please. So we continued the studies on purslane, and I was vitally interested in melatonin because melatonin is a potent antioxidant, anti-carcinogenic agent. And as you can see here, it is again, purslane is much higher than spinach or strawberries, this amount. I mean, it's just a perfect little plant. In fact, the Department of Agriculture used to refer to purslane as a weed, in fact, a weed that creates problems. And now it's considered a power plant. Its position changed. Next slide, please. So having then we looked at a number of wild plants. It became very obvious that the wild plants have more vitamins, they have more omega-3 fatty acids, and they have more essential minerals. So the next thing I looked at, because I was at our summer home, which is outside Kalamata, and I saw the chickens eating purslane. So I said, I wonder if the egg of that chicken is different from the eggs that you have in the supermarket. So I went ahead and boiled for 5 minutes about a dozen eggs and brought them back to the National Institutes of Health. And as you can see, you don't have to look at all the data. The Greek egg, which in the literature actually it refers to the Greek egg or the Ambelistra egg from the name of the farm, is very different from the standard supermarket egg, where the ratio, the omega-6 omega-3 ratio, it's hard to omega-3 from here, is for the Ambelistra egg is 1.1, where for the ratio for the supermarket egg is 19.4. So what it shows is that, can you change it? That's good, much better. Okay, thank you very much. So here we have then the Greek egg, in terms of the total saturated, has more saturates. But what is very important is it has a much higher amount of the omega-3 fatty acids it has 17.66 milligrams versus 1.7 for the supermarket egg. So when you look at the ratio then of the omega-6 to omega-3, the Greek egg is 1.3, where the supermarket egg is 19.4. When you do studies with these two different types of eggs, the Greek egg would lower the cholesterol. So that, and the reason being that the egg yolk has omega-3 fatty acids, number one, and number two, it has a higher amount of monounsaturates. Next slide, please. So we then began to continue and look how different is the traditional Greek diet relative to vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids. And so, as you can see here, we have 2% milk from the US, cheddar cheese, American, Swiss. And the Greek mizithra and the Greek feta. And the longer chain fatty acids, the EPA, DPA, and DHA, which are what you find in the fish and fish oils, are present in the Greek milk and its products, in this case mizithra and feta, because the animals graze. Where in the US, where the cattle is grain-fed, there is nothing. So that not only that we have a lot of omega-6, but we have totally depleted the food supply in all Western diets of the essential fatty acids. Next slide. And then we continue the studies. And you know, in Crete they eat a lot of snails. My friend, Dr. Renaud from France, was vitally interested in the composition of snails, being French, of course. So I bet with him, and I won the bet. I said the Greek snail, because they eat purslane and other things, have to have more alpha-linolenic acid than the French. Again, showing that what the animals feed influences the composition of their muscle, which then we eat. So far then, I proved to you that the wild plants have alpha-linolenic acid omega-3 more so than the cultivated ones, that the egg yolk contains omega-3 fatty acids, that the milk from cows and sheep that graze contain essential fatty acids, that snails that also graze contain more essential fatty acids. Next slide, please. And here, a lot of the fish that we eat is farmed fish. Well, I can tell you that farmed fish has much less omega-3 fatty acids, as you can see here, than the fish in the wild. So that even when we try to eat more fish and we farm fish, we still don't get as much as we would if we were out fishing for fish. Next slide, please. So I went back and looked at the data. And here are the data on the composition, the fatty acid composition of serum cholesterol esters in terms of the omega-3 fatty acids in the people in Crete versus the people in Zutphen, which is a city in Holland. So the people in Crete had 3 times as much omega-3 fatty acids as the people in Holland, and you would expect them to, because after all, everything they ate had omega-3 fatty acids. Next slide, please. So in traditional diets, omega-3 fatty acids are found throughout the food chain. Eggs have a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 of 1:1. Therefore, pasta made with eggs and milk that is rich in omega-3 fatty acids is enriched in omega-3s. Pasta made with water and flour or regular milk is not enriched in omega-3s. So what we found then was that the traditional diet of Greece is a diet where the omega-3 fatty acids were found throughout the food supply. So if for breakfast you just had cheese and bread and coffee or fruit, you would get your omega-3s. For lunch, no matter what you had, you would get your omega-3s. And for dinner, whether you ate meat or you ate fish or you had an omelette, you got the omega-3s. So what was very characteristic of the diet of Greece is a diet where the essential fatty acids are balanced. They're found throughout the food supply, and they are very high, these diets are very high in antioxidants, and they are very rich in essential vitamins and essential minerals, so that it is a diet that is very similar to the diet in which human beings evolved. No other Mediterranean diet has these characteristics. That's why I said you have to emphasize the Greek diet, the traditional Greek diet. Nowhere in the Mediterranean you find this type of food supply. Also, don't forget that the people around the Mediterranean are of different religions. And as a result, they, for example, in North Africa, being Muslim, they will not eat pork or will not drink wine, where Greeks have always drunk wine, which of course in moderation is very good for you. So all this data, we published them in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the people in France carry out the very famous Lyon heart study, which is as following. They took a total of about 600 individuals and who already had one episode of heart disease, and divided them into two groups. The control group was of the American Heart Association diet, whereas the experimental group was on the diet of Crete, the way we defined it, and I just told you. So they have to have at least almost 2 grams of the omega-3 fatty acids. And they, within 4 months, they noticed that there was a difference in the death rate. For example, the experimental group, which is in orange here, began to have less death rate, less deaths. And most importantly, they didn't have any sudden deaths. And at the completion of the study at 2 years, you can see the difference. There were less all cause of death, less cardiovascular deaths, no sudden deaths in the Crete diet in orange. And this increase in one non-cardiovascular death actually was an accident. And there were much less non-fatal MI. And when you look at the total major primary endpoints, you end up with the people who were on the diet of Greece had 70% less deaths. And this now has been reproduced in many other studies. Next slide, please. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the DASH study, which is the diet to stop hypertension. When I looked at it and I developed this slide, so here you have the control diet, and then you have the combination diet. And when I went back and calculated what the combination diet had, which was very important, is it had more fish, from 0.2 servings per day to 0.5. And it had nuts, seeds, and legumes, all of which have the omega-3s. And when you look at the composition of the intervention diet, it's very similar to the diet of Crete. Next slide, please. Next slide. No, I think there was one more before that. Okay, so the people in India, they became very interested, and they're vegetarian, so they went ahead and they increased the amount of fruits, vegetables, legumes, walnuts, and almonds, and the amount of omega-3 fatty acid of about 2 grams. And you can see the people who are on the intervention diet versus the traditional vegetarian diet, they were able to lower the omega-6, omega-3 ratio from 38 down to 9. And the total cardiac endpoints, they were almost half, much less sudden cardiac death and much less non-fatal MI, all significant. So that when you take the traditional diet of Greece and you modify it to suit whatever other population you have, whether it's the French, whether it's the Americans on the Dutch diet, or the Indians, the results are all the same. And that is what is so special about the diet of Greece. Next slide, please. So once we had all this information, we went ahead and decided that we were going to write a book called The Omega Diet, which is the traditional diet of Greece. And here are the 7 dietary guidelines of the omega diet. It says, eat foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids, such as fatty fish, salmon, tuna, trout, herring, mackerel, walnuts, canola oil, flax seeds, and green leafy vegetables. Or if you prefer, take omega-3 supplements. Use monounsaturated oils, such as olive oil and canola, as your primary fat. Now, the reason you need to change the oils is because all the vegetable oils are extremely high in omega-6 fatty acids. Eat 7 or more servings of fruits and vegetables every day, and eat more vegetable protein, including peas, beans, and nuts. Avoid saturated fat by choosing lean meat over fatty meat, and low fat over full fat milk products. You know, feta is a low fat cheese. Avoid oils that are high in omega-6 fatty acids, including corn oil, sunflower, soybean, and cottonseed oils. And then, of course, reduce your intake of trans fatty acids by cutting back on margarine, vegetable shortening, commercial pastries, deep fat fried food, and most prepared snacks, mixes, and convenience food. So this 7 dietary guidelines, actually it's just the interpretation of the traditional Greek diet. When we did the book based on our data, I said Greeks eat a lot more fruits and vegetables than what the USDA recommend, 5 a day. And we could have said eat 9 a day, but we came up with 7, trying to remember chronically how much fruit and vegetables I eat. And roughly comes up to that much. But don't forget that the Greeks make a meal by having horta and olives and a sardine or just a piece of cheese. We don't really need to have meat with every meal. And it's very easy to increase the amount of legumes in your diet by not only making, traditional soups, but you can put them in salads and you can just go ahead and make them appetizers. And the more beans and chickpeas one eats, the better you're off. And don't forget that the French, they serve lamb with lentils. And lentils is you don't need to have rice and you don't need to have potatoes all the time. It's very easy to sort of modify the diet by sticking more and more to the traditional diet of Greece. And of course, wine is very important. I want to skip some slides, and I want to go towards the end. Actually, I don't need the slides. Never mind. In Italy, they did a very important study because there's very good evidence that omega-3 fatty acids are very important for the development of the baby in utero and then for the first 2 years of life. And that's why infant formula today contains omega-3 fatty acids. Remember, a whole generation of people who were premature were brought up on cow's milk that did not have any omega-3 fatty acids. Cow's milk does not have any omega-3s. there are a lot of data that they show that absence of omega-3 fatty acids in the diet interferes with IQ. In other words, you have a much higher IQ. Some of the breastfed babies, not all, have a much higher IQ than bottle-fed babies. That's number one. Number two is now they have done studies in Finland and in the UK and also in the US in adolescents who are in detention houses or in prison. And these individuals have violent behavior. There is no omega-3 fatty acids in their diet, which is really phenomenal. Then, in terms of the studies that were done in Italy, they have been able to show that if you give 1.8 grams of EPA and DHA, the fish oils, to healthy young adults, you can improve the mood, they can sleep better, they feel less tired, and they have very accurate measurements where these studies are being done. And then in terms of memory and cognition, as we get older, the omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, is becoming very important. And the best study I know on this subject was carried out by Yvonne Freund-Libby at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. And she worked with 3 different groups of patients, those that have very early Alzheimer's disease, those that have moderate or mild, and those that were severe. And giving them 2 grams of EPA and DHA, it decreased the rate of degeneration only in those patients where they were caught early. In other words, in the very mild cases, the rate of progression into Alzheimer's definitely decreased, which really tells you a lot that if you want to maintain a healthy body and a healthy mind, it is very important that you stay on a diet that is consistent with the diet in which we evolved, because this is how our genes were programmed to respond. If you go around and develop foods that did not exist during the Paleolithic period, there's going to be a certain proportion of the population that are genetically predisposed in developing these diseases more so than others. So I thought I will stop, and I will be glad to answer any questions you might have.
I'd like to make a comment. Your talk was wonderful. I'd like to add something more that Mr.
Oh, go ahead.
Scientific work.
Too much. Oh, wait a minute. I have to tell about this slide. Leave it there. This is the slide that they have it in their St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital in Houston, Texas. Denton Cooley, the very famous cardiac surgeon, 8 years ago when I spoke to them, he changed the whole hospital and the cafe and the restaurant into the omega diet. That's the book. And that's their emblem what they have outside the hospital. Okay, go ahead.
I'm trying to say that the last few years, this that you say about, genetics, genes of the individual, the locale of the individual, where he lives, either this is a human or an animal or plant, is affected by, a number of factors, and the main factor is the so-called commensal bacteria. The bacteria that, we have in our intestine, upon birth, every human being or animal obtains some bacteria, and colonize the intestine. By 6 months after birth, we have about 100 trillion bacteria in our intestine. These bacteria are also a senior tool for each individual. In other words, every individual has a different, although the numbers is the same, although, the kinds are the same, the species, in spite of that, there are also certain bacteria that, are specific for the individual. They call signature bacteria. This bacteria, of course, have something to do with the food that we eat, because these are the bacteria, that they break down the food. And the interaction between the food, the bacteria, and the epithelium of the gastrointestinal tract is fundamental, for the homeostasis and health of the individual. The animals that, graze in Greece have different bacteria than the animals that, graze, in Texas. Or the chicken, Therefore, every one of these, has a difference, that, affect, the person that, eats them. The other thing, the genomic effect of the bacteria to our genome. I have a genetic, makeup, which is transmitted from our ancestors down, but also we have genomic, interaction between the bacteria of the intestine and, our genome. Therefore, the thing is very complicated, but again, it becomes more obvious. So that, these things that you mentioned before, about, the value Mediterranean has different, mortality and different, makeup, in so-called sicknesses, etc. It's true. But the main thing is that, now, we have, a area that, is tremendous, importance, but very difficult to investigate at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Have there been any studies where people either they have high omega-3 or omega-6 diets, so that could be the control, but the variable would be exercise, to see how important exercise is, and it probably varies by the genetics of each person, counteracting, let's say, processed foods or bad cooking and bad oils?
Yeah, actually, I have a slide that shows. Okay, then I'll repeat the question. What she wanted to know that the effect of exercise and how important it is relative to the omega-6 and omega-3, right? And actually, I have a slide that shows the effects of omega-3 fatty acids and physical activity are exactly the same. And those of the aging process are exactly the opposite. So that by being on a diet where the essential fatty acids are balanced and also being physically fit and exercising, it really doubles the effect in terms of health. In terms of weight loss, if you are on a low-calorie diet and take omega-3 supplements and exercise, not only you lose the weight, but you also maintain the weight much easier. So there's a lot of studies on that. I didn't have time to cover. Yes.
Could you discuss a little bit, there's a lot of different supplements out there and recommendations on what should be the recommended dose, like Lovaza versus other
Right.
formulations?
Well, ideally, people should be on a traditional diet of Greece, ideally. So you're here in the United States and you eat at least one meal a day away from home. And that is a meal that is very high in omega-6. I can tell you from the studies, the ratio continues to be 16:1, omega-6 to omega-3. So that in order to bring a balance or to improve it, you need to take about 1 gram of EPA and DHA fish oils a day as a supplement, just to balance that. People who have one episode of heart attack, they should get 2 to 3 grams. People with schizophrenia, they get 6 grams a day. And depression, they get about 4 grams a day. It varies with the disease.
I know it's out of your present day lecture, but can you mention something about vitamin D? Because recently it has Yeah, recently.
Well, definitely. Greece being a country with a lot of sunlight, Greeks have much higher levels of vitamin D. The amount of vitamin D that we need to have, just strictly for health reasons, is not the requirement of 400 milligrams per day, but it should be 2,000 milligrams or 2 grams. This is now pretty well accepted. And there are some other people that they say, well, I think you should measure D3 and then give as much as is needed to bring it up to about 75 nanograms per ml. So there are 2 ways to do it. Take 2 grams or have it measured and see how much more you need to take to bring it up to that. I take 2 grams a day.
How much is done? How much is
There are other questions?
με την ώρα βέβαια, υπάρχουν στο
One question, I think it's very easy to know what the Greek diet was 50 or 100 years ago, but how does one establish with any confidence, given how much the climate has changed over the last 4 million years, what our diet was 50,000 years ago or even 4 million years ago? How can we have this confidence?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. First of all, almost 50 years ago, more than that, people began to think about the importance of the omega-6 and omega-3 essential fatty acids. And at that time, there were quite a few populations who were hunter-gatherers, and they had not been, I would say, near civilization at all. One group were the Yamamoto in South America. Another group was American Indians in the Northwest. And then there were the Aborigines in Australia. And then they discovered this island group of Madagascar in that area, in the Indian Ocean. And they did very careful studies on these people. And they were able, by looking specifically at bones, to evaluate, from looking at their bones, to evaluate those that were buried, they were found in caves. And they were very similar to the populations at that time. And so you can use C13 and you can do measurements, you can distinguish between protein coming from marine sources versus protein coming from animal sources. And you can develop a complete picture of that. And that's how you get the information on that. In fact, I can tell you, in the caves at Mycenae as well as Crete, they were able to show that the men ate more fish than the women. In other words, they had much more marine protein in their bones, and they lived longer than women. And it's the only time when you find anything where the men live longer than women.
One
Just
more
for your
question.
reference.
What?